Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Jedan je od vodećih evropskih stručnjaka za korupciju, povrat imovine i pravne reforme. Proteklih 15 godina pomagao je vladama da uđu u trag finansijskom kriminalu, neprijavljenoj imovini političara i sudija i da ojačaju integritet svojih institucija. Gost emisije Recite Al Jazeeri je Tilman Hoppe. Mr. Tilman, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, I recently read an old interview with Dr. Peter Eigen, founder of Transparency International, who said that when TI was founded back in 1993, speaking about corruption was a taboo. Many companies back then filed bribery as business expenses. In Germany and in most other developed countries, foreign bribery was not only allowed, but it was tax deductible. So comparing that to today, have we come a long way?
In fact, I think we did. Like 20 or 30 years ago, foreign bribery was legal in all countries of this world. And today, it's illegal and a crime in all 190 countries of this world. So to me, this is actually a miracle, how the entire world can change in just 20, 30 years to such an extent. And it's not just about the laws, it's also about implementation, because we have companies now that have been fined more than $1 billion for having paid bribe abroad. So a lot has changed in law and in practice.
Right. Conventional wisdom tells us, or at least that is widespread thinking, that in underdeveloped countries, corruption is a systemic problem which is difficult to root out because it has crystallized a vicious circle that is difficult to break. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you made an interesting statement about the underdeveloped world. There is some so-called underdeveloped countries which actually have very little corruption. And that is interesting. A country like Bhutan, which is actually a poor country, or Botswana in Africa, which is a poor country, and they stand out for having very little corruption. And at the same time, you have developed countries where everywhere you have corruption problems. So in a way, the question is not whether you have a country without corruption, but what the level of corruption is and what are the reasons? Why is this country like this? Why is this country like this? So corruption is everywhere, just the intensity is very different and the response is very different.
Right, but just how present is corruption in the developed part of the world?
You have to look into the whole integrity system of each country. How strong is it? How strong is it by architecture? And then how strong is it by implementation? And you just happen to have some countries, for example, like Bhutan or Botswana, which are considered to be underdeveloped, but the attitude of the people there is very strong, and maybe they also had some historic luck that certain developments took place. And so they're in a good position today. And then you might also have OECD countries like Mexico, which have a big corruption problem and possibly bigger than the one in Bhutan.
Mm-hmm. Now, to what extent has the global perception of corruption changed over the recent decades?
I think there's two realities. The one is that we speak a lot more about corruption, and the public is much more aware about corruption. And the discussion has become much, much more refined about what public officials can do and what they shouldn't do. And this has created maybe the impression that there's more corruption nowadays. But I don't think this is the case. I think we're speaking more about corruption. We are demanding more integrity. And I think probably we are in a way where corruption is actually getting less overall. I think it was just hush-hush 40 years ago.
Right. Corruption is considered one of the main problems for Western Balkan countries in their path towards the EU. Why do you think Western Balkan countries are not successful when you compare them with other countries that have undergone a similar transition from communism to democracy?
I think most countries do reforms only under pressure. Sometimes you have like this this lucky moment after a change of government or after revolution that there's like this euphoria of fighting corruption, but in the midterm or in the long run, governments do it only under pressure. Pressure from the street or pressure from international bodies. And the only international body that really has pressure is actually the EU, which can put the carrot of candidacy or accession in front of the countries. And to put it a bit bluntly, I think Western Balkan countries mostly did reforms only like because the EU was pressing them or because they received pressure from the street. Why should the government elite have an interest in limiting its own rights or in looking into its own corruption scandals?
Right. Now, through your work for the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative, you have been supporting asset declaration reforms in the region. Can you explain why asset declarations are important for countering corruption? Is it legally justified that asset declarations invade the privacy of judges and public officials for the sake of integrity?
Well, the European Court of Human Rights and many other courts around the world have confirmed that asset declarations are in line with human rights and that publishing them online is justified, and that using them for firing inexplicably wealthy public officials is justified, even if that goes back 20 years. Like a public official was buying an apartment 20 years ago and can't explain where did you get the money from. So this public official can be fired, and the European Court of Human Rights has confirmed that, and we see it now all over Europe, but mostly in Moldova and Ukraine, where we have strong integrity vetting going on, that public officials stumble over their past asset declarations. Because when we really check, we can see, hey, you were lying. You didn't have the financial means for buying these assets. And then these contradictions is what get the public officials in trouble and eventually out of office.
Right, but is there at least anecdotal evidence that asset declarations actually contribute to fighting corruption?
It's the anecdotal evidence we can see in Moldova right now, where 66% of the candidates who were applying to become a member of the judicial self-governance body in Moldova were taken out of the competition because we could see that from the asset declarations, there's problem with their wealth. The same we're seeing in Ukraine, the same we were seeing in Albania, the same we see all around the world. In the Philippines, the chief justice was dismissed because they discovered $1 million US dollars, which were not declared. And the chief justice explained, I got this from speculating with stocks when I was a student. One of these like many ridiculous explanations we hear when we catch public officials. So there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that asset declarations are very effective if they are implemented.
Right, but we agree that judges and candidates for public office need to have integrity. How would you ensure that asset disclosure systems are not going to be abused?
Frankly, I think this whole argument about abuse is a horrible cliche. I think anything can be abused. For example, the police. We see many countries where the police is abused, so should we not have police? Or in Russia, the tax authorities are abused to harass the opposition, so we should not have taxes? Or in China, the media are abused, so should we not have the media? Should we abolish Al Jazeera? So the abuse argument comes from people who do not want anti-corruption reforms. If you have wealth you cannot explain, you have an integrity problem. It's not a political issue.
Right, but as long as state institutions are mistrusted and politicized, and they are, will the members of the supervising bodies and anti-corruption agencies be unlikely to enjoy the trust of the public because they're also nominated by or elected by the politicians, right?
Well, it's true. There's a connection between politics and then the people who are at the head of integrity bodies. But this connection is not automatic. We can look, for example, again, to Ukraine, which was very innovative in this regard. In Ukraine, they started appointing the heads of integrity bodies by going through international commissions. I happened to be on one of those commissions in 2019, and So the decision on who is this head of the anti-corruption body was actually taken by a commission where international members had the decisive vote, and they looked thoroughly into all the candidates. So with this involvement, international involvement, you could cut the local networks and the favoritism, or even only the perception of such favoritism. And Ukraine has repeated this exercise over and over with different higher institutions, and the public is very satisfied by and large with all of these results. So I think it's a great innovation.
Right, but do you think that regional cooperation on exchange of data on asset declarations could effectively contribute to countering corruption in the Western Balkans? I mean, you have been supporting the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative, RAI, in the development of the international treaty on exchange of data for the verification of asset declarations. Do you really need this treaty, or is it just another tick in the box?
Well, I think anything is a ticking the box exercise if it's not implemented. Even a media enterprise like yours is just ticking the box, or even worse, is abuse in a country like Russia or China or Azerbaijan. So it depends on the implementation.
Mm-hmm. Now, based on your experience all over the world, you have been working in more than 40 countries. Do you think that regional cooperation could be one of the mechanisms to successfully tackle corruption, or do you think every country should find a way to solve its problems on its own?
Well, I think it's almost a rhetorical question, because I think our problems have no borders. Criminals smuggle drugs across borders, they bribe across borders, they launder money across borders. So I think nobody would be so stupid to think that countries can solve this challenge on their own. But I must say, countries in the Western Balkans have signed this treaty on regional, or rather international cooperation, but they have not yet ratified it. So I'm wondering why. Are the governments scared of the difference this treaty can make? The signature was done in March 2021, and so now 2.5 years later, we have no ratification. Ratifications can be done even in 1 week or 1 month only if you really want to. So, in my opinion, or my suspicion here is, the countries are scared.
Right, but how important is cross-border cooperation in the Western Balkans specifically, where everything is quite intertwined?
No, I think nowadays, with our world like growing together and being so intertwined on an international level, it's impossible to fight corruption on your own. You can see it with an asset declaration. The public officials, let's say in Serbia, they usually don't have their bank account in Serbia, the one they're hiding, or the nice seaside property. Well, besides Serbia having no seaside. So we will find the seaside properties in Montenegro. But if the asset declaration body in Serbia, the anti-corruption agency, has no access to the real estate cadastre in Montenegro, there is no link, and it's an outrageous situation. We need international cooperation. Otherwise, asset declarations remain, in a way, just a window dressing exercise to some extent.
Right. So besides your work with the international organizations such as UNODC, Council of Europe, and RAI, you collaborate closely with prominent CSOs like Transparency International and UNCAC Coalition. It is often said that transparency is the best antidote to corruption, and that transparency needs a strong and demanding civil society vis-a-vis the public authorities. But what if a country's civil society is corrupt and bent only on receiving Western funding for personal gain?
I can see the cases you're referring to. I would still object in a way by saying it's not the entire civil society which is corrupt. What is civil society? All citizens, all NGOs? I would say, name me one country where the civil society is corrupt. Even if we take Russia, in Russia or even in China, there's people who dare to stand up, even without any funding, let alone Western ones. And it's those people we speak about, and it's those people who provide the example. And you speak about Western funding as if it was a bad thing, and I wish there was more Western support sometimes. for example, for the RIGHT Treaty, for this international treaty of exchanging data for asset declarations? What does the European Union do for the treaty? Why did the EU Commission not yet propose for the EU to join the treaty? Where are the steps here? I would suggest you ask the EU, what are you doing in this regard?
Now, are you of the opinion that fines for corruption-related offenses in the Western Balkans should be increased and correlated both with the income and property of the offenders, the value of the undue benefit obtained, as well as the damage caused?
I think you're quoting three standard factors, which should be standard factors for fines in any country in principle. So my answer is yes to all of this. And I know sanctions are often too low in several of the Western Balkan countries.
Now, I remember when I visited Singapore that they had draconian fines and prison sentences for public officials found guilty of siphoning off state funds and squandering state money. I was wondering what your opinion was, and do you think this approach could be applicable in Europe and in the Western Balkans in specific?
I think we can learn from Singapore, but I think whipping people with a stick in public is not an option for Europe. I was also in Singapore and I saw the posters. So if you steal, you will be beaten up in public, if I remember correctly. The problem, I think, for the Western Balkan countries is not that we're missing whipping in public. What we're missing is sometimes sanctions at all. There is no sanctions, or they are too lenient. They don't include the factors you were mentioning, or it's just an administrative fine, while it should actually be a criminal sanction, or even including prison. And this is particularly true in the area of asset declarations.
Now, moving back to Europe, fighting corruption has been a goal for Ukraine's government ever since the 2014 revolution that toppled Russian-backed leader and fueled Ukraine's hope for a European future. Now, according to Kiev's top anti-graft police officer, he said that fighting corruption is no longer seen as just a crime, but it is a crime against national security. So, is it too far-fetched to call it a crime against national security? And how do you root out corruption when your country is at war? Well, I hope the war will end soon and no Russian soldier will be left on Ukrainian territory. And certainly Ukraine has big challenges in fighting corruption, even if there hadn't been a war, but it also has done excellent reform steps. And I think Ukraine is in several aspects more advanced than most Western Balkan countries. For example, when it comes to asset declarations. Some Western Balkan countries, for example, Bosnia, should be ashamed if they compared their own country to how far Ukraine has come, even during the times of war. And Ukraine is currently considering joining the RIGHT Treaty for international exchange of data. And so I hope they will do so very soon. Right, and also Ukraine has joined the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative as an observer. But do you think that fighting corruption is also a fight for strengthening a country's democracy? Are the two correlated? Well, maybe it's a surprising answer, but I think you don't need democracy to fight corruption, like in the sense of bribery. Singapore is a good example. It's a weak democracy, but it's considered a success story in fighting corruption. But if you want a strong democracy, I think you need to minimize corruption. Right, Mr. Tilman, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much.